It was late evening, the kind of night when the city lights painted the streets in shades of gold and gray. The sky had already turned dark and a thin mist hung in the air, making everything look softer but slightly unreal. The streets were quiet except for the occasional sound of a car passing by, or the distant hum of traffic from the main road. Two police officers were on their usual patrol, driving slowly through their assigned area, checking corners, shops, and parking lots. It had been a long shift, nothing unusual, nothing dangerous, just the same routine they followed every night. Inside the patrol car, the air was calm but heavy with fatigue. One officer sat behind the wheel, sipping coffee that had long gone cold. His partner stared out the window, scanning the sidewalks and parked cars. They both hoped the night would end quietly. Then the radio crackled. A voice came through, sharp and clear. A suspect had been spotted near a convenience store on Oak Street, a man wanted for a string of burglaries and assault. The dispatcher described him as wearing a gray hoodie, around mid-30s with a scar near his left eye. The message ended with a note of urgency: approach with caution. The suspect may be armed. Both officers looked at each other. The calm of the night was gone in an instant. The driver straightened up and flicked on the siren, then turned it off after a moment, deciding to approach quietly instead. They didn't want to alert anyone too soon. The car rolled down the street, its headlights cutting through the mist. The convenience store came into view, a small place with a flickering neon sign that buzzed weakly in the cold night air. The parking lot was almost empty, except for one dark sedan parked near the entrance. The description matched. A gray hoodie, dark car. It all lined up too perfectly. The officers exchanged a quick glance. Without a word, they stepped out of the car. One stayed slightly behind, hand resting near his holster, while the other walked toward the store entrance. Through the glass door, they could see a man inside, standing near the counter holding a small bag and a bottle of water. He looked calm, maybe a bit tired. But there was something about his body language that caught their attention. He kept glancing at the door, as if nervous about someone watching him. The officer pushed the door open. The bell above it chimed softly. The man turned his head and froze. For a second, time stood still. The officer took a step forward, keeping his voice firm but controlled. "Sir, can we speak with you for a moment?" The man blinked, confused. "Is something wrong?" he asked, his tone polite but uncertain. "Could you please set the bag down and step outside with us?" The officer replied, trying to keep things calm but assertive. Something in the man's expression changed. Not guilt, but confusion mixed with fear. I don't understand," he stammered. "What's this about?" The second officer entered the store, quietly taking position near the door. The man looked between them, realizing that something serious was happening. He started to protest again, but by then the first officer had already taken his arm. "Sir, please cooperate," he said. "We just need to verify something." The store clerk watched silently from behind the counter, unsure whether to speak or stay quiet. Outside, the mist seemed thicker, the city suddenly distant. The man was led to the patrol car while still trying to explain that there must be some mistake. But the description matched too closely, and his car fit the report exactly. Once they reached the car, the officers asked for his ID. The man patted his pockets. Realizing he didn't have his wallet on him, he said it was probably in the car. That only made things worse. The officers exchanged another look, too many coincidences. The driver checked the car's license plate. It wasn't on any wanted list, but that didn't rule out the possibility that the man had switched vehicles. Within minutes, the man was handcuffed. "I think you've got the wrong person," he said, his voice steady but with a trace of panic. "Please, just check my car. My ID is there. I can explain everything." "We'll handle that," the officer replied, trying to sound reassuring, though his tone was clipped. "Right now, we just need you to stay calm." The man took a deep breath and didn't resist. He didn't shout, didn't fight, just kept insisting there was a misunderstanding. The officers admired his composure, even if they believed it came from being used to police encounters. Back at the store, a small crowd had gathered, curious bystanders who whispered and recorded on their phones. The officers worked quickly to avoid attention. The clerk came outside, hesitant, and said the man had only bought a few items, nothing suspicious. But to the officers, it was another trick. Suspects often acted normal before fleeing or attacking. After the arrest, they drove back to the station. The city lights passed in a blur. The man sat quietly in the back seat, his wrists locked behind him, staring out the window as if trying to make sense of what was happening. His calmness made one officer uneasy. He couldn't help but wonder if they might actually have the wrong person, but the thought was quickly buried. They had to trust the report. The fugitive had been spotted nearby, and this man fit every detail. At the station, the man was taken to an interview room. The officers filled out paperwork reporting the arrest. Their supervisor congratulated them on quick action. There was even talk that the case might make the local news. After all, the suspect they thought they had caught was wanted for weeks, and the city had been on edge because of his crimes. Inside the small room, the man sat on a metal chair, his hands resting on the table. The fluorescent light above buzzed softly, casting sharp shadows on the wall. He looked exhausted. When one officer entered to begin questioning, the man gave a small, tired smile. "Can I please just explain?" he said quietly. The officer nodded, sitting across from him. "Go ahead." "My name is Daniel," the man said, his voice steady. "I work in another city. I'm just visiting family here. I went into the store to grab something to drink before heading back to my hotel. I have no idea who you think I am, but I promise you've made a mistake." The officer listened but remained skeptical. "You don't have your ID, and your car matches the description of the suspects. You can understand why that looks suspicious." "I know," Daniel replied, leaning forward slightly. "But if you just check the car, you'll find my wallet in the glove box. My name, my work ID, everything's there, please." The officer hesitated. Something in the man's tone was too calm, too genuine. Most suspects reacted with anger or denial. This one seemed hurt. "I'm not here to argue," the man continued. "I respect what you're doing. I just need you to know I'm not the person you're looking for." The officer said nothing. He left the room to check with his partner. In the hallway, they talked quietly, debating whether to run his fingerprints first or search the car. Their supervisor urged them to stay cautious and follow procedure. Fingerprints first, verification later. As the night went on, fatigue began to settle in. The officers filled out more reports, contacted nearby stations, and waited for results from the database. The man remained inside, quiet and patient, occasionally asking for water. He didn't raise his voice once. Hours passed, and still no confirmation came through. The officers began to feel a strange tension in the air, the kind that comes from uncertainty. One of them walked back into the room and looked at the man sitting there. "If you're telling the truth," he said slowly, "this will all be cleared up soon." "I hope so," the man replied softly, "because right now it feels like my whole life depends on it." Outside, dawn was beginning to break, painting the sky in pale blue and pink. The city was waking up again, unaware of what had just unfolded in that small room. To the officers, it was just another arrest, maybe one that would make them look good in the department. But something about it didn't feel right anymore. The officer who had first spoken to the man couldn't shake the feeling that they'd acted too quickly. He replayed the scene in his mind, the way the man looked genuinely confused, the missing wallet, the calm tone in his voice. None of it matched the behavior of the violent suspect they were after. Still, procedures had been followed. Reports had been filed. For now, all they could do was wait. The man sat quietly, staring at his reflection in the metal table. He wasn't angry anymore, just tired. Somewhere deep down, he hoped that someone, anyone, would realize the mistake before it was too late. And so, the night that began as a routine patrol ended with an arrest that would soon shake the very foundation of the police force itself. An arrest that looked perfect on paper but would soon unravel everything they thought they knew about justice, assumption, and the cost of being too sure. The morning light crept slowly through the blinds of the small interview room. The man sat there, still wearing the same gray hoodie, his hands now free but his heart heavy. He had barely slept all night. Every sound from the hallway, footsteps, a door creaking open, the buzz of the fluorescent light above, made him hope someone would walk in and tell him it was over. But no one did. Across the station, the two officers from last night were also awake, though neither had slept well either. They had been praised for their quick response, even congratulated by their supervisor before the end of the shift. But something about the whole thing didn't sit right with them. The man's calmness, the quiet way he kept saying they were making a mistake, it all felt too real to ignore. Still, procedure came first. The paperwork had to be done, the fingerprints had to be processed, and the report had to match what the department expected. Everything had been written and logged. To the rest of the station, it looked like a successful arrest. But to the officer who had first spoken to the man, it felt more like a question than a victory. As the morning hours passed, the man's fingerprints finally came back from the system. When the results showed no match to any criminal record, confusion spread through the room. One officer frowned at the screen, rubbing his eyes as if he had read it wrong. Another ran the search again. The same result appeared and no match. "This doesn't make sense," one of them muttered under his breath. "The suspect's prints should be in the database. They've been wanted for weeks." The supervisor shrugged it off. "Run it again. Maybe the system's down." But the system wasn't down, and the man sitting in that small room wasn't who they thought he was. The officer who had doubted things from the start finally walked back to the interview room. The man looked up at him, tired but still calm. "Any update?" he asked quietly. The officer hesitated. "We're still checking," he said, though his voice lacked its usual firmness. "The system didn't find anything." The man gave a small, weary smile. "That's because I'm not the one you're looking for." There was no anger in his voice, no sarcasm, just quiet truth. It made the officer's stomach twist. "I left my ID in my car," the man continued. "If you let someone check, you'll see it there. My name, my job, everything." The officer nodded slowly. "We'll see what we can do." Outside the room, a small argument started between the officers and their supervisor. The older man insisted that they should hold the suspect until everything was verified. "You know how many people say they're innocent?" he said, his voice gruff. "If we let him go and he really is the guy, we'll be the ones in trouble." The younger officer didn't respond. He just looked toward the glass window of the interview room. The man inside wasn't acting like a criminal. No shouting, no excuses, just quiet exhaustion. Hours later, they decided to search the man's car. The keys had been taken when he was brought in. One of the officers went out to the parking lot, unlocked the vehicle, and opened the glove compartment. There it was, a brown wallet. Inside were several cards, a driver's license, a work ID, and a photo of a small family. Everything was clean, perfectly normal. When he came back inside and placed the wallet on the desk, the room fell silent. The ID showed a different name than the suspect's. The address was from another city entirely. And the work ID confirmed his job. He wasn't a criminal, but a police trainer from another district. The realization hit like cold water. The two officers exchanged stunned looks. "He's one of us," one whispered. Their supervisor stared at the ID, his face tightening. "That can't be right," he said. "Run it again. Call his department." They did. The call took a few minutes, and those minutes felt like hours. The officer on the other end confirmed everything. The man was indeed part of their force, a well-respected instructor who had been in the city for a training program. Silence filled the room once more. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating. Everyone realized the gravity of what had happened. Back in the interview room, the man sat still when the door finally opened. The officer who had doubted from the start walked in holding the wallet. His face was pale. We checked your car," he said slowly. "You were telling the truth." The man didn't react right away. He just looked at the wallet, then at the officer. His eyes were tired but not angry. "I told you," he said softly. "But I understand. You were just doing your job." The officer's throat tightened. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "We should have listened sooner." The man nodded. "It's okay. I just want to go home." But leaving wasn't that simple. The department had already logged the arrest, and reversing it meant going through a long list of procedures. The man had to wait while forms were rewritten, and supervisors debated how to handle the situation. Some wanted to cover it up quietly. Others thought they should report it properly. By midday, the story had already started to spread inside the building. Whispers filled the halls about how the two patrol officers had arrested a fellow cop by mistake, how the system failed to match his identity, how no one noticed the difference sooner. Some laughed nervously about it. Others shook their heads in disbelief. The man was finally released after several more hours. As he stepped outside, the bright sunlight felt almost too harsh after the long night inside. He took a deep breath of fresh air. One of the officers walked him to his car. "I don't even know what to say." the officer admitted, his voice low. "This whole thing, it shouldn't have happened." The man looked at him with a faint, understanding smile. "You're right. But it did, and now maybe something good can come from it." The officer frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" The man paused before getting into his car. "Sometimes a mistake like this makes people pay attention to things they've ignored for too long. Maybe it's time we change the way we handle identification. Maybe it's time we slow down before assuming." The officer nodded. His chest felt heavy with guilt, but also with a strange sense of clarity. He had been taught to act fast, to trust instinct. But that night had shown him how dangerous instinct could be when mixed with pressure and fear. After the man drove away, the station felt different. Conversations were quieter. The laughter that usually echoed in the corridors had faded. Everyone knew they had made a huge mistake. The report of the arrest had already reached higher offices. Within a day, an internal review was ordered. Supervisors were questioned, reports rechecked, body cam footage examined. The more they reviewed, the clearer it became. Every step of the process had followed the book. And yet, the result was still wrong. The officer who had doubted from the beginning couldn't shake off the guilt. He replayed the moment they handcuffed the man, the fear in his eyes, the confusion in his voice. It haunted him every time he closed his eyes. Late that night, long after his shift ended, he sat alone in his car outside the station. The city lights reflected on the windshield. He thought about the words the man had said before leaving, about slowing down, about not assuming. He realized how easily things could go wrong even with good intentions. Meanwhile, the man who had been mistaken for a criminal reached his hotel. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the badge in his wallet. For years, he had trained young officers on how to avoid errors, how to keep calm under pressure, and yet, even he had become a victim of the very system he believed in. He thought about the officers who arrested him. They hadn't been cruel, just too sure, too quick to decide what was true. He wasn't angry at them. He was angry at how easily it could happen again. The next morning, he wrote a short message to his superiors, explaining everything that had happened. Not in anger, but as a report, a reminder that even the best systems could fail when humans forget to question their certainty. Over the following days, rumors turned into headlines. Someone leaked the story to the press. "Police arrest one of their own in case of mistaken identity," the article read. It spread fast. Comment sections filled with criticism, some mocking, some serious. The department tried to contain the story, but it was too late. And though it was painful, that mistake began to change things. Meetings were held, training sessions updated, new policies discussed. For the man who had been wrongly arrested, it wasn't about blame anymore. It was about prevention. For the officers, it became a lesson they would never forget. That sometimes doing everything by the book isn't enough if you forget the person behind the uniform, behind the description, behind the assumptions. What began as a night of routine patrol had now turned into something that would echo through the department for years. The mistake had shaken their confidence, but it also opened their eyes. It wasn't just about one wrong arrest. It was about how fragile truth can become when judgment moves faster than understanding. The next few days felt heavy for everyone in the department. The mistake wasn't just a rumor anymore. It had become a story people were whispering about everywhere. What had started as a routine arrest now hung over the entire station like a dark cloud. Officers who used to walk in with confidence now spoke in low voices, careful not to draw attention. Every glance felt like silent judgment. Every conversation a reminder of what had happened. The officer who had doubted the arrest from the beginning couldn't focus on his work. He kept thinking about the man's calm voice, his tired eyes, the quiet way he had said, "You're making a mistake." Those words echoed in his head, making him question everything he thought he knew about instinct and procedure. At home, his wife noticed the change. He wasn't sleeping well and spent most nights staring at old reports or rewatching body cam footage. When she asked what was wrong, he just shook his head and said, "It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. Deep down, he knew that one small error, one wrong assumption, had done more damage than any real criminal ever could. Meanwhile, the man who had been arrested tried to move on. But the experience stayed with him too. Back at his training center, his colleagues welcomed him warmly, but the questions never stopped. Everyone wanted to know what it felt like, how something like that could happen to one of their own. He tried to explain without sounding bitter. They weren't bad officers, he said softly. They just didn't stop to think. They wanted to do their job right, but sometimes, in the rush to be right, we forget to be careful. He didn't blame them, but he couldn't forget the cold look in their eyes that night. The way they were so sure. Every time he closed his eyes, he could still feel the handcuffs around his wrists and hear the sound of the patrol car door closing. At the police station, an internal review was underway. The chief called several meetings, demanding explanations. He wanted to know how something like this had slipped through. Reports were read and reread. The officers' actions were compared to protocol. Technically, they hadn't broken any rules, but morally everyone knew something had gone wrong. The younger officer was called in for questioning. He sat stiffly in front of a table with two senior investigators. They asked him to describe every step of the night, from the moment the call came in to the moment the man was released. He told them everything honestly, including his doubts. When he finished, one of the investigators sighed and said, "You followed the rules, but you didn't follow your gut all the way through. Sometimes doing the right thing means slowing down." Those words stayed with him long after the meeting ended. Days turned into weeks, but the story refused to fade away. News outlets picked it up, spinning it into a headline that stung every officer who read it. Police force arrests one of their own, a mistake that questions the system. The chief hated seeing the department's name dragged through the mud, but he also knew they couldn't bury the truth. Transparency was the only way to rebuild trust. To fix the damage, a public statement was released. It admitted the mistake and promised new training for all officers on how to handle identification and verification during arrests. Some people appreciated the honesty. Others mocked it, saying it was too little, too late. The department's reputation took a hit, and everyone could feel it. The man who had been mistaken for the fugitive received a formal apology from the chief himself. It wasn't done in private, but during a small press conference meant to show accountability. The chief stood beside him, looking solemn. "We regret the error and take full responsibility," he said. "We are reviewing our procedures to ensure this never happens again." The man nodded quietly but didn't smile. When reporters asked him if he forgave them, he simply replied, "Forgiveness isn't the issue. Understanding is." That simple answer spread faster than the apology itself. People shared it online, calling it powerful and wise. But for the officers involved, it only deepened the ache in their hearts. One evening, the younger officer found himself driving near the same convenience store where it had all happened. He parked his car and sat there for a while, staring at the spot where they had first seen the man. The neon sign still flickered weakly above the entrance, just like that night. For the first time, he walked inside, not as a cop, but as a regular person. The same store clerk recognized him and gave a small nod. "You were here that night, weren't you?" the officer asked quietly. The clerk nodded again. "Yeah, I remember that man. He didn't do anything wrong. He looked scared, though. Not the kind of scared you see in criminals. More like someone who couldn't believe what was happening." The officer sighed. "We thought we were doing the right thing." The clerk looked at him for a long moment before replying. "Maybe you were, but sometimes being sure doesn't mean being right." That sentence hit him harder than he expected. He bought a bottle of water, thanked the clerk, and walked out into the cool evening air. As he sat in his car, he realized that what hurt the most wasn't the public criticism. It was knowing how close they had come to ruining a good man's life completely. At the same time, the wrongly accused man started getting letters from people all over the country, some from police officers, others from ordinary citizens. Some thanked him for handling the situation with grace. Others shared their own experiences of being judged too quickly. He read every letter carefully, sometimes staying up late just to respond. He didn't see himself as a victim. He saw the whole event as a painful but necessary reminder that the system wasn't perfect, and neither were the people who worked in it. He decided to turn his experience into something useful. Weeks later, he was invited to speak at a police training seminar. The room was filled with officers, both young and experienced. When he stood in front of them, the room went silent. Everyone knew who he was. He began speaking softly. "I want to start by saying I don't hold anger in my heart for what happened, but I do hold responsibility, not just for myself, but for all of us. Because this wasn't just one person's mistake. It was a reminder of how easily we can lose sight of what matters." He paused, letting the words sink in. We train ourselves to act fast, to protect, to control. But in that rush, sometimes we forget to look, really looking at the person in front of us. Not as a suspect, not as a target, but as a human being. The room stayed quiet. Some officers looked down, others nodded slightly. He continued. That night I was scared, not because I was being arrested, but because I realized how powerless the truth becomes when no one's willing to listen. You can be completely innocent, but if someone decides you're guilty, your voice stops mattering. That's what shook me the most. When he finished, there was a long silence followed by quiet applause. The officers didn't clap out of formality. They clapped because they felt the truth of his words. After the seminar, the younger officer approached him. He looked nervous, unsure what to say. I was one of the officers that night, he said softly. The man studied his face for a moment before nodding. I know, he said gently. And I'm glad you came. I wanted to say I'm sorry, the officer said, his voice trembling slightly. Not just for what happened, but for not trusting my own doubts. I should have done better. The man placed a hand on his shoulder. We all should, he said kindly. What matters is that you've learned from it. Don't let it break you. Let it teach you. The officer nodded, his eyes wet but relieved. For the first time since that night, he felt something lift from his chest, a quiet kind of forgiveness that didn't erase the past but made it bearable. When the man left the seminar that evening, he felt lighter too. The air outside was cool, and for the first time in weeks, he smiled. The mistake had shaken the police force, but maybe, just maybe, it had also changed something deep within it. Inside the department, new guidelines were introduced. Officers were now required to verify identification more thoroughly before making an arrest. They were also encouraged to pause and reassess situations when things didn't feel right. It was a small step, but it was a start. The story slowly faded from the news, but its lesson remained alive in every patrol, every call, every moment of hesitation before acting too fast. The officers who lived through it carried that memory with them, a reminder that truth often hides behind what seems obvious, and that sometimes being human means admitting when you're wrong. That mistake, painful as it was, became the reason the department changed forever. And though no one could erase what had happened, everyone knew one thing. That night had opened their eyes not just to their duty, but to their humanity. Weeks passed, but the effects of that night still lingered like a shadow no one could escape. Inside the police department, things had changed quietly but deeply. There was no more laughter in the break room, no more light-hearted teasing among officers. Everyone seemed a little more careful, a little more aware of how a simple choice could spiral into something much bigger. The two officers who had made the arrest went back to work, but they weren't the same. Every time they stopped someone or responded to a call, that memory returned. The sight of a man they had handcuffed for no reason, the confusion in his eyes, the soft way he said he was innocent. It haunted them. Even when they were praised for other good work, the compliment didn't feel right anymore. Something had shifted inside them. The younger officer especially carried the weight like a silent burden. He tried to act normal, but at night when the city went quiet and his thoughts grew loud, he replayed the whole thing over and over again. He wondered how many other times things like this might have happened to people who weren't as calm or forgiving as that man. One morning he walked into the station to find a meeting already underway. The chief was there, along with a few senior officers and a woman from the Internal Affairs Unit. The atmosphere was tense. They were talking about new protocols, stricter ID checks, updated communication procedures, and additional training sessions. It was clear that the department wanted to rebuild its reputation and regain public trust. The officer sat quietly, listening. He knew this was necessary, but he also knew it wouldn't fix what had already happened. No policy could erase the look in that man's eyes. No form or checklist could replace the human judgment that had failed that night. After the meeting, the chief called him into his office. The chief was an older man with tired eyes, the kind that had seen too much over too many years. He gestured for the officer to sit. I know this hasn't been easy for you, the chief said slowly. You've been through a lot. We all have. But I want you to know something. Mistakes don't define us. How we respond to them does. The officer nodded. I understand, sir. I just wish we could take it back. The chief sighed. We can't. but we can make sure it never happens again. That's what matters now." The officer left the office feeling both relieved and restless. He wanted to believe things could change, but a part of him still felt like he owed the man something. Not just an apology, but an effort to make it right somehow. A few days later, he found out the man who had been wrongfully arrested was coming back to the city. This time it wasn't for training. He had been invited to help design a new course on responsible policing and decision-making. The news spread through the department quietly. Some officers felt awkward about it, others defensive. But most knew it was the right thing to do. When the man arrived, there was no tension in his face. He greeted everyone politely, even the officers who had arrested him. His calmness was still the same, steady, patient, but this time, there was something different behind his eyes. He wasn't there to shame anyone, he was there to help them see. During the first training session, the room was packed. Officers sat silently as the man spoke. He didn't use fancy words or complicated examples. He just told his story, step by step, from the moment he was stopped to the moment he was released. Every detail came out slowly in his soft but steady tone. "When it happened," he said, looking around the room, "I kept thinking it had to be a dream. I thought any second someone would realize the mistake and let me go. But the longer it went on, the more helpless I felt. Not because I was afraid of being hurt, but because I realized my words didn't matter anymore. My truth didn't matter. You decided who I was before I could even speak." The room was completely still. No one moved. No one looked away. His words struck something deep in everyone there. He continued, "That night didn't just affect me. It affected all of you too. It shook the department, the community, and even the way people see us as a force. But it also gave us something rare, a chance to learn, not from a tragedy, but from a mistake that didn't cost a life. That's a gift if we choose to treat it that way." After the session ended, officers stayed back to talk to him. Some asked questions, others simply thanked him for his honesty. The younger officer waited until everyone had left before approaching. "I wasn't sure you'd want to come back here," he said quietly. The man smiled faintly. "I thought about it for a long time, but I realized avoiding it wouldn't help anyone. Sometimes facing a mistake is the only way to heal from it." "I'm still sorry," the officer said. "Every time I think about that night, I feel like I failed you, and myself." The man looked at him with kindness. "You didn't fail me. You just forgot to see me. That's what happens when fear and pressure take over. You're not the only one. But now that you've seen it, make sure it doesn't happen again." That conversation stayed with the officer for a long time. It gave him a strange sense of peace, something he hadn't felt since the night of the arrest. He realized forgiveness wasn't about erasing what happened. It was about learning to carry it differently, with awareness instead of guilt. Over the next few weeks, the man worked closely with the department. Together, they built new training, programs that focused not just on law enforcement, but on empathy, communication, and situational awareness. They ran role-playing exercises, teaching officers how to slow down and listen before acting. The changes weren't easy. Some resisted, saying they didn't need lessons in compassion. But gradually, the results started to show. The atmosphere in the department began to soften. Officers talked more, shared more, and began to see their work not as a fight against people, but as a service for them. One afternoon, the man and the officer stood outside the station, watching a group of recruits finish their training exercises. The air was warm and the sound of laughter carried across the lot, something that hadn't been heard around the station in a long time. "They're learning fast," the man said with a small smile. "They are," the officer agreed. "You've done something good here." The man chuckled softly. "We've done it together. It's strange, isn't it? How something so painful can lead to something better." The officer nodded slowly. "Yeah, I just wish it didn't have to happen that way." The man looked thoughtful. "Sometimes the only way to see clearly is after you've been forced to stop and look back. Mistakes have a way of opening our eyes, if we're willing to learn from them." The officer smiled, realizing how true that was. For the first Time and months he felt proud again, not because of an arrest or an accomplishment, but because he had grown. As the sun dipped behind the buildings, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, the two men stood quietly. The city buzzed around them, cars honking, people talking, life going on. But in that small moment, there was peace. The man eventually returned to his city, but his impact stayed behind. The department kept his lessons alive through every new officer who joined. His story became part of the training material, not as a warning of failure, but as a reminder of humanity. Months later, the officer received a letter. It was from the man. Inside was a short message written neatly on white paper. "It's been some time since that night. I wanted you to know I'm doing well. I hope you are too. Every mistake carries a seed of change. You just have to let it grow. Take care of it." The officer folded the letter carefully and placed it inside his locker. Whenever he felt tired or doubtful, he'd read it again. It reminded him why he became a police officer in the first place. Not for authority, not for praise, but to protect and serve with understanding. The case that had once shaken the entire police force slowly turned into a story of transformation. What began as a painful embarrassment became the foundation for something better. A culture of reflection, patience, and humility. Even years later, whenever new recruits asked about the story, older officers would tell it with quiet honesty, not to scare them, but to remind them that being a good officer wasn't about being perfect. It was about staying human. And in that simple truth, the department found its redemption. The weeks following the man's training sessions brought a sense of cautious calm to the police department. Officers went about their duties more thoughtfully. Every call, every patrol, every interaction with the public seemed to carry a little more care than before. The memory of that mistaken arrest was still there, quietly influencing decisions, shaping behavior. It was a constant reminder that judgment could fail, even with the best intentions. The younger officer often found himself reflecting on that night. He had started to write notes, little reminders to himself about patience, observation, and empathy. At first he thought of them as simple checklists, but soon they became more than that. They were lessons he wanted to carry for the rest of his career. Every time he reached for them, he remembered the calm voice of the man he had arrested, the way he had spoken truth quietly and without anger, and how he had remained patient while waiting for others to see what was real. Meanwhile, the man who had been arrested began a series of speaking engagements in different cities. Police departments invited him to share his story, not as a tale of embarrassment, but as a lesson in careful policing and the importance of human judgment. Everywhere he went, he told the story with the same calmness and clarity that had first impressed the officers at his own department. "I am not here to blame anyone," he said in one seminar. "I am here to share what can happen when we stop seeing the person in front of us. I want you to understand how easily a mistake can occur, even in the hands of people trained to protect." Officers listened intently, many taking notes, some nodding silently. They could see themselves in his words, recalling moments when they had acted quickly, relying on instinct rather than pause and verification. His story was no longer just about one man. It had become a mirror reflecting everyone in the room. Back at the original station, life slowly returned to routine, but with new awareness. Officers were now trained to double-check identities before acting, to observe small details, to verify facts rather than rely on assumptions. The department also encouraged officers to speak up if something didn't feel right. A shift in culture that seemed small on paper, but enormous in practice. One day, the chief called a meeting to address the officers directly. His voice was firm, but not harsh. "We made a mistake," he said, looking around at the faces in the room. "It cost us trust, it cost us credibility, and it could have cost a life. But mistakes are also lessons. We've learned from this, and now we must use that knowledge to improve. Every one of you is responsible not just for following orders, but for seeing clearly, thinking critically, and treating people with respect." The younger officer, sitting near the back, felt a sense of relief. He had been carrying the weight of that night for months. Now it felt as if the department itself was acknowledging it, not to punish, but to learn and grow,